The human psyche is not a unified whole. It is composed of different parts, many of which operate entirely outside the reach of conscious awareness. When these parts are shaped by unintegrated traumatic experiences, they gain such an intense emotional charge that they become functionally independent, operating with their own logic and agenda. Carl Jung called these psychological structures autonomous complexes. But what exactly are these complexes? Why do they have such power over our lives? And most importantly, how do they silently shape our identity without our knowledge? Simply put, a complex is a psychic core formed around an emotionally charged memory, usually rooted in pain, fear, shame, or humiliation that has been dissociated from the conscious ego. By being excluded from the individual's conscious narrative, this traumatic content fragments and gains a kind of life of its own. Not in a literal sense, but functionally. It begins to act as if it were a separate entity with its own intentions, its own way of perceiving reality, its own method of operating. These complexes are directly responsible for those disproportionate emotional reactions that seem to make no rational sense whatsoever. A small criticism triggers an explosion of rage completely out of proportion to the situation. A genuine compliment generates profound discomfort, guilt, or even panic. A healthy relationship that could bring fulfillment is sabotaged for no apparent reason, leaving everyone confused. These are not conscious, deliberate responses. They are automatic activations of complexes buried deep in the unconscious. It is the past violently invading the present. And the most disturbing aspect of this mechanism is that these complexes do not act only episodically, in isolated moments. Over time, they fundamentally shape recurring behaviors, create limiting beliefs, and even construct entire aspects of your identity. Many people unknowingly live much of their lives driven by these complexes, automatic patterns that repeat in an almost ritualistic manner, always unconsciously seeking to resolve what has been left emotionally open. But without conscious awareness, without deliberately facing these patterns, all they can do is endlessly repeat the pain in new forms. Jung observed with clinical precision that unintegrated trauma tends to manifest cyclically, like a script that plays over and over. The person unconsciously attracts situations and relationships that mirror the original wound with eerie accuracy. A pattern of emotional abuse, for example, repeats itself with different faces, different circumstances, but the same underlying dynamic. Why? Because the unconscious is desperately trying to heal that wound, to finally resolve it. But without conscious awareness, without deliberately working through the trauma, the psyche can only relive the pain, not resolve it. The mind is actively seeking closure, completion, but it finds only repetition, an endless loop. This is a fundamental point that changes everything. The unconscious is not trying to punish you. It is not sadistic. It is trying to complete an interrupted story, to finish something that was left unresolved. But when trauma is not faced with lucidity and courage, the same script repeats infinitely. And with each repetition, the groove deepens, the pattern becomes more entrenched. However, there is something even more subtle and infinitely more devastating that happens over time. In many cases, the complex becomes so dominant, so central to the psyche, that it begins to confuse itself with the self. The person begins to believe they are that complex. The victim becomes fused with their pain. The rejected person becomes defined by rejection. The abused person becomes synonymous with fragility. And then any attempt at genuine change feels like an existential threat. Because if the pain goes away, if the familiar suffering dissolves, who is left? Who am I without this defining story? This is the trap of identification with the victim, a phenomenon that Jung identified as one of the most powerful and invisible barriers to true healing. In the next part, we will delve deeper into this critical point: how trauma infiltrates and corrupts identity itself, why we unconsciously resist healing even when we consciously desire it, and how the narrative of pain can become an invisible prison we don't even realize we're locked inside. When pain becomes identity, the trap of victim consciousness. Among Carl Jung's most psychologically unsettling discoveries is the realization that trauma often does not merely leave deep marks on the psyche. It actively shapes the very identity of the individual, becoming the foundation of their sense of self. Over time, pain ceases to be just a memory, just an experience you had. It becomes a mirror. And when we stare into that mirror for too long, day after day, year after year, we eventually come to believe that we are what we see reflected back. We become the victim. This phenomenon is what Jung described as identification with the complex. When a trauma is intense enough and remains unintegrated, deliberately kept outside conscious awareness, it becomes the gravitational center of the entire psyche. Everything begins to orbit around that pain, like planets around a sun. The personal narrative you tell yourself, your core beliefs about the world and other people, your relationships, your behaviors, everything becomes filtered through the distorted lens of unresolved trauma. And the most frightening part of this process? It happens silently, unconsciously, almost imperceptibly over time. You don't wake up one day and decide to become defined by your pain. It creeps in gradually until it's all you know. Identification with the victim is not a conscious desire to suffer. It is absolutely not masochism or weakness. It is an unconscious attempt to maintain psychic cohesion in the face of potential internal collapse. In other words, if pain was the most significant experience of your life, if suffering was the only constant you could depend on, then your unconscious will desperately cling to it as an axis, as the organizing principle of your existence. Because without it, you may feel that there is nothing left, no coherent story, no stable identity, no recognizable self. That is why so many people unconsciously resist healing, even while consciously claiming they want it more than anything. Not because they secretly enjoy suffering, but because they fear the terrifying emptiness, the void that might come afterward. Who would you be without that trauma defining you? Who would you be without the protective anger that keeps people at a distance? Without the familiar fear that guides every decision? Without the heavy sadness that has become your constant companion, your proof that you exist? Pain can be unbearable, crushing. But the uncertainty of the unknown, the uncertainty of an identity not built on suffering, can feel even more frightening to the unconscious mind. And so we remain trapped, locked in destructive patterns that we recognize but cannot seem to escape. We return to abusive relationships that hurt us. We sabotage ourselves at precisely the moments when success is within reach. We unconsciously attract humiliation, neglect, abandonment, not due to lack of strength or intelligence, but because there is an unconscious part, a wounded part, that genuinely believes this pain is all that we have left, all that makes us real. Jung saw these repetitive, self-destructive behaviors as failed attempts at symbolic resolution. The unconscious is trying desperately to close the wound, to heal it. But lacking conscious awareness, lacking the tools of integration, it can only repeat the original traumatic scenario over and over, as if by reliving the same pain in new contexts. The psyche is somehow hoping for a different ending this time. But the ending never changes. The story plays out the same way each time, with the same emotional devastation, as long as the narrative is not consciously rewritten with open eyes and deliberate intention. This understanding changes everything about how we approach healing. It reveals that the path forward does not involve simply forgetting the past or getting over it through willpower. It involves carefully undoing this deep identity fusion with pain, relearning, slowly and compassionately, who you actually are beyond the trauma, dissolving the invisible prison you didn't even consciously know existed. But how is this profound work actually done? How do you undo years, sometimes decades, of unconscious identification with suffering? How do you separate what is authentically you from what was imposed by pain and survival? In the next part, we will delve into the heart of the Jungian healing process, the three fundamental stages that allow for genuine confrontation, recovery, and integration of trauma. And we'll explore why these essential stages are so often overlooked or rushed through by conventional therapeutic approaches. The three stages of Jungian trauma healing. Most modern therapeutic approaches focus primarily on emotional regulation strategies, cognitive restructuring, and symptom management. They attempt to restore what appears to be normal functioning of the conscious ego, to help you manage your reactions and appear more stable. But Carl Jung saw trauma as something far deeper, something that could not be resolved merely by calming the surface waters while the depths remained dark and churning. For Jung, genuine healing required a descent, a deliberate and courageous journey into the darkest basements of the soul, into those places where the trauma was originally buried, and where it still operates powerfully in the shadows, controlling behavior from below. This healing journey occurs in three profound stages, which form the essential core of the Jungian approach to trauma integration: conscious confrontation, recovery of lost aspects, and symbolic integration. The first stage, conscious confrontation, demands something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding, looking directly at the wound without flinching. Not with cold intellectual analysis, but with full emotional presence. It involves deliberately revisiting the pain with open eyes, without dissociating, without minimizing, without rationalizing it away or creating comfortable narratives. It is about being there, fully present, feeling the anguish completely, without desperately trying to erase it or make it disappear. Jung believed with absolute conviction that repression was the greatest enemy of individuation, of becoming whole. Because everything that is avoided, everything pushed down into the unconscious, returns later disguised, distorted, and often far more destructive than it was originally. This confrontation is not merely reliving the trauma, re-traumatizing yourself. It is facing it as a conscious witness, with awareness and intention. It is the crucial moment when the ego, instead of fleeing in terror or denying reality, confronts what was fragmented and scattered, and begins painstakingly to piece it back together. This is the beginning of the self's rescue from the unconscious. But this naturally leads us to the second stage, recovery of lost aspects. When we experience significant trauma, we do not just lose peace or security or trust. We lose actual parts of ourselves, pieces of our authentic being. A trauma can completely kill a child's natural spontaneity and joy. It can permanently silence the voice of someone who once spoke with strength and confidence. It can utterly destroy the capacity for trust, for unguarded joy, for the ability to surrender to love without fear. Jung called this phenomenon soul loss, essential fragments of the psyche that detach and hide themselves deep in the unconscious as a desperate form of self-protection. If it hurts too much to be spontaneous, that spontaneity gets locked away. If vulnerability led to devastating betrayal, the capacity for vulnerability goes into hiding. At this stage of therapeutic work, the process resembles inner archaeology. You are carefully digging deep into layers of the psyche to retrieve these lost parts, these exiled aspects of yourself. And crucially, you're not just recovering them as distant memories or abstract concepts. You're recovering them as living potentials that need to be actively reintegrated into your present life. It is not enough to intellectually understand what was lost. You must actually reincarnate these parts in real, embodied life, learning to laugh again without guilt, to trust again despite the risk, to desire without shame, to create without fear of judgment, to bring back the vitality and aliveness that trauma froze solid. The third stage, and perhaps the most sophisticated and transformative, is symbolic integration. Here, the goal is absolutely not to justify the trauma, not to say it was meant to happen or was somehow good. Rather, it is to give the experience meaning within the larger context of your life journey. Jung saw the symbol as the fundamental language of the unconscious, as a bridge between the inner and outer worlds, between the personal and the universal. When we manage to symbolize trauma, to find its place in the larger narrative, it ceases to be merely a destructive event that happened to us. It becomes a portal, a threshold to transformation. This does not mean romanticizing the pain or being grateful for suffering. It means recognizing with clear eyes that by traversing that particular suffering, certain qualities emerge that would never have been awakened. Otherwise, genuine resilience forged in fire, deep compassion, born from your own wounds, psychological depth that only comes from descending into darkness, clarity about what truly matters that only emerges from confronting mortality or loss. The wound does heal, though it takes time, but it leaves a mark, a scar. And this scar, when understood symbolically rather than just as damage, becomes a source of strength and wisdom. Jung said with profound insight, "We do not heal by denying the darkness, but by illuminating it." And this is precisely what symbolic integration accomplishes. The darkness loses its destructive, controlling power when consciously brought into the light of meaning and understanding. These three stages, confrontation, recovery, integration, are not linear or mechanical. They do not happen once and then you're done. They are spirals, cycles you move through at deeper and deeper levels. Often, the process requires returning to the pain more than once, revisiting forgotten aspects, finding new symbols and meanings as you develop greater capacity. But with each turn of the spiral, the conscious ego becomes stronger, more stable, more integrated, more aware of itself. And it is at this critical point that a fundamental transformation occurs. The trauma, once a gaping wound that controlled the individual completely, becomes a scar that teaches. It is no longer the center of identity, the organizing principle. But it is an integrated part of the journey, acknowledged and understood. The pain does not magically disappear. That's not how the psyche works. But it is transcended. It is placed in proper context. In the next part, we will explore exactly this transition, what it actually means to live with the scar rather than with the open wound. What life becomes when trauma ceases to be an inner tyrant and transforms into a mark of wisdom and transformation. We will talk about true emotional freedom, the kind that arises not from the denial of pain, but from the full, conscious integration of what you survived. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day practical path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Living with the Scar. Transformation beyond healing. Most people unconsciously believe that healing from trauma means returning to who they were before it happened, as if there existed some pure, intact version prior to the traumatic impact, and that healing was simply a path of return to that original state. But Carl Jung dismantles this comforting illusion with surgical precision. For Jung, true healing is not regressive but transformative. It is not about going back to an imagined original self. It is about becoming someone entirely new, someone who would never have existed without that specific pain, that particular journey through darkness. The scar is not a flaw or defect. It is a seal of evolution, a mark of transformation. When trauma is truly integrated through conscious work, it loses its parasitic power over your life. It does not disappear or get erased from memory, but it ceases to act as an unconscious core that constantly hijacks your identity and behavior. Instead of dictating your automatic reactions to life, it transforms into understood memory, into experience that informs rather than controls. You still remember the pain clearly. The memory remains. But it no longer decides for you. It no longer pulls your strings like a puppet master. This transition marks a crucial moment in the psychic journey, the replacement of reactive conditioning with conscious presence. You stop living on autopilot, mechanically reenacting old wounds in new relationships and situations. And you begin to choose, clearly and deliberately, how you want to respond to life as it unfolds. This is the difference between being driven by the past and being informed by it. Jung described this state as the integration of the personal unconscious into the self. Trauma, when properly symbolized and integrated, becomes part of a larger, more comprehensive system of meaning. It aligns with your existential narrative in a way that makes sense. And in doing so, it transforms from a source of ongoing suffering into a wellspring of hard-won wisdom. This is not theoretical, academic, or merely rational wisdom gained from books. It is a type of embodied wisdom earned through experience, the wisdom of someone who has survived the seemingly unbearable and emerged from it with expanded vision, genuine strength, and deep compassion for the suffering of others. This transformation does not occur through ready-made formulas or by simply denying what happened. It requires actually crossing through the territory of pain, not going around it. And at the end of that crossing, what you discover is not a corrected or repaired version of your old self. What you find is an entirely new psychic entity, more whole, more real, more profound, more authentically yourself than you ever were before. It is at this point that trauma ceases to be purely a curse and becomes what Jung called an initiatory experience, a turning point in the journey of individuation, an event that, although never desired or sought, becomes ultimately revealing. It reveals where your oldest, deepest wounds were hidden. It reveals parts of yourself that desperately needed to be rescued from the unconscious. It reveals strengths and capacities that only emerge when tested in darkness. The scar, in this context, is profoundly symbolic. It tells a story, your story. But crucially, it is a story you can consciously narrate, a story you own. It is not a story that possesses and controls you. The difference is subtle but utterly transformative, because while the open wound bleeds and paralyzes, keeping you trapped, the healed scar guides and teaches. It serves as a permanent reminder not of victimhood, but of survival. It reminds you that you have been to the bottom and returned, that you have been afraid and faced it anyway, that you have been psychologically broken and rebuilt yourself with your own hands, piece by painful piece. Healing, for Jung, is this alchemical process in which the heavy lead of suffering gradually transforms into the gold of consciousness. Raw pain becomes wisdom, Fragmentation becomes integration. Unconscious reactivity becomes conscious choice. But this demanding journey does not need to be made alone, and in fact it should not be. The process of individuation, as Jung called this path of psychic integration and wholeness, is too demanding, too challenging to be traversed in complete isolation without support or guidance. In the next and final part, we will talk about what it actually means to live consciously after the integration of trauma. Why this awareness requires ongoing commitment, continuous courage, and a fundamentally new relationship with your own history. We will understand what it truly is to live fully in the present with hard-won wisdom, without being constantly dragged backward by the invisible currents of the unresolved past. The new beginning, living consciously after integration. Healing from trauma is not a finish line where you cross and then stop. It is not an end point. It is a new starting point, a new way of being in the world. When you finally integrate the experiences you have tried to avoid your entire life, when you bring them into consciousness and give them proper place, something profound and fundamental happens within you. You do not free yourself from the past, as if it never happened. You free yourself in the present moment. Pain ceases to be the gravitational center of your identity, the organizing principle around which everything revolves. The memories continue to exist, intact. They don't vanish. But they no longer hold the reins of your existence. They no longer control how you show up in the world. Carl Jung taught us with clarity that true liberation does not come from repression, from pushing things down and pretending they don't exist. It comes from integration, from consciously including all aspects of experience. What you repress becomes your destiny, controlling you from the shadows. What you integrate becomes your strength, becomes wisdom you can actually use. And that is precisely why the journey inward, no matter how painful and uncomfortable it may be, is always more powerful, more transformative than the endless attempt to escape. Living with awareness after the integration of trauma is not living without pain. Pain is part of being human. It is living without being enslaved by pain, without being defined and controlled by it. It means that even if certain old emotions still visit you, occasionally grief, fear, anger, they no longer invade your inner home without permission. They knock on the door. And now you have a genuine choice. You can welcome them with maturity, with understanding of their origin and purpose. You can sit with them, hear what they have to say, and then you can decide consciously how to act. Not react automatically from old programming, but respond with awareness. This is the essence of individuation, becoming whole, even with the cracks and scars. And being whole is absolutely not the same as being perfect or undamaged. It is recognizing your darkest parts, your shadow aspects, without crippling shame. It is learning to say with honesty, yes, this terrible thing happened to me. I carry this experience. But also firmly affirming, this does not define the totality of who I am. I am more than my trauma. It is living with compassion, not only for others who suffer, but critically for yourself, because you know intimately what it means to carry the unbearable. And you know what it takes to move forward anyway, despite everything. This psychic maturity, this integration, does not arise from theories or quick fixes or motivational speeches. It emerges from the courage to face your own story with clear eyes and an open heart. When you finally stop running away from yourself, when you stop fleeing from your own inner truth, you can finally begin to live as a genuinely whole human being. The scar is still there. It always will be. That's reality. But now, it no longer bleeds and weakens you. Now, in a strange way, it shines. It becomes a source of strength and authenticity. If you have made it this far in this video, through all these difficult truths, you may have recognized parts of yourself in what we've explored. You may have seen yourself in patterns that now suddenly make sense for the first time. And perhaps, just perhaps, you have felt the beginning of an inner call, a call to look at yourself with more honesty, with more courage than you have before. So now it is up to you. The work is yours to do. Comment below. Which part of this journey resonated most deeply with your own story? What truth have you been avoiding facing? I read every comment and genuinely want to know how this content impacted you. And if this video touched you in any meaningful way, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming content on depth psychology and transformation. The next video is essential for anyone truly committed to their process of self-discovery and healing. Watch it now. It will be as deep as this one, and perhaps even deeper, taking you further into the journey of becoming whole. Are you ready to continue? I'll see you there.